Data leakage. We've gone through a set of these quirky webinars now, Richard. I think quirky title webinars. This is the fifth one, I think. And we've talked about uh, identity protection. Then we talked about how do you protect your endpoints. Then we talked about how do you harden your servers. And then we talked about how do you protect your cloud. And I feel like data is almost like that final frontier. Although everyone's trying to protect, or everyone should be trying to protect the identity, but data is where the hackers are trying to get to, right? And that's the reason why data needs to be properly protected and secured when it comes to when it comes to having that final defense in place. And that's what this webinar is going to be about: is different ways of protecting your data, right? And what are they after, really, right? They're after your personal information, they're after your financial information, healthcare information, intellectual properties that you may have, any competitive advantage and information that can be stolen and sold, any data on IT security that can further compromise the organization, and that's why protecting data has become very, very important in today's scenario.
Yeah, exactly. There's really good points about how, any of that kind of sensitive information being leaked is definitely very profitable for cyber criminals. And the thing is that usually when you think of data leakage, you think of it as, you have somebody, infiltrating your system and getting access to your data. But sometimes this can be completely unintentional as well. And
Right.
people are just trying to, reduce that digital friction of, not being able to get access to the things they need when they need them. And so, they might share it on something that's not as secure, trying to make their lives easier, but really they put themselves and the organization at risk.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and we see this time and time again. It's the USB in the back of the cab. And that's happened so many times where you get those letters from various groups, whether it be our friends at the CRA or really any other groups. You get that letter in the mail and it says, "Oh, we're sorry, your data has been leaked," or someone, we lost access to it. It was disclosed on a USB, and we're not sure where it went. Or it's a laptop, or it's, there's all these different stories, and some of them are intentional and some are completely unintentional. So we can explore a lot of those today.
The threats to data leakage. Richard, why don't you set the stage here?
Yeah, so when we talk about data leakage, we just talked about whether it could be accidental or intentional. And then when we're looking at intentional data leakage, they really come through a number of different areas, but some of the most common ones include ransomware. And it seems odd because usually the ransomware, the impact is they lock down your data, they encrypt it, and it's tied up, so you can't get access to that data. But what we're starting to see now is the companies that are able to recover from ransomware and they don't pay the ransom, well, then they're getting extorted. Because at the end of the day, the attacker would have full administrative access over the client's network. And in doing that, they may download a bunch of that data before they do the encryption. So they have a backup. They have a way to then try to still coerce payments out of the client. Point blank is really, if you don't pay the ransom, then they're going to try and extort you. So that's a definite threat to data leakage because they can just post your data online. And we've seen that through various groups. And it ends up being quite effective for them because then it's the extra method of them being able to collect a payment. We've also seen some state-sponsored APTs, even in, we're looking at the beginning of the pandemic where there was the research that was ongoing of trying to make a vaccine for COVID-19. And what we started to see is some of the countries started, instead of researching, the vaccine and figuring out how to write how to solve the problem, it's more who are the groups who are working on this that we can steal this from, right? So it's looking at the cyber realm as a potential way and a method for them to obtain access or to cut some corners. Why spend $1 billion or several $1 billion researching a vaccine when you could steal it for $28 with someone on a burner computer? So you do have options like that where someone can be a bit more creative. And then we've seen, hacktivists. In the news right now is Anonymous versus Russia, and we saw tons and tons of data being leaked out. We saw the central bank in Russia. We saw the top agency that's responsible for all their propaganda was compromised. We saw the Kremlin themselves, their CCTV was compromised. There's a number of different areas, but what happened through all of these is that there was a bulk upload of data. So a lot of data got out, very sensitive information, which is still being reviewed by the media, but that information really shouldn't have fell into the wrong hands, but it was leaked out through a threat actor. Lapsus is one of those groups that it's quite hard to categorize them. They're not, they have in the past, I believe, impacted and deployed a ransomware, but that's not the name of the game for them. They're an international hacking game. And I've always tried to categorize them as hacktivism or something else, but they're kind of on that fence of they're just a hacking game. And we've seen them compromise NVIDIA, Microsoft, Okta, and a number of others. They leak data as well. When they get into an organization, the purpose of getting into that organization is generally to leak data. So you can look at them as a credible threat. It's not to say they're targeting everyone, but it's just kind of layering the type of threat that you would experience. Competitors. There are some instances where competitors are actually trying to get ahead of the competition, and through doing that, they're compromising their competing companies to try and figure out what are they up to, what is their roadmap, what are the next steps, and this crosses into intellectual property theft or pricing and other areas. But the other one that I think is worth mentioning as well is the disgruntled employee. Employees have access to a ton of data, and they tend to make personal backups, right? So we look at that, your staff is not happy, there's always the potential for data loss. I'm leaving this company, I'm moving on to the next, and with that I want to leverage the things that I've learned at this company to apply to the next role. And it's not always that it has a malicious intent. They could be disgruntled and they just want a new opportunity, but it could really be a disgruntled employee. It was a termination or something like that, and they have a bunch of data and they just want to leak it out. We've even seen groups like Lapsus that are just paying for access to networks, which then enables and opens up the door for data leakage. So there's a number of different threats that we should really consider when we're thinking about data leakage. And there's various reasons that they could be going after data, but I think we should really dial in and start talking about the types of data that these groups are after.
Actually, just a couple of quick points about ransomware and lapses that come to mind. The thing with ransomware is, they can come in, they encrypt your entire file storage. Let's say you also pay a few thousand Bitcoins to get the key to decrypt it. The problem is that these encryption algorithms are not going through SDLC and QA checks, right? So even after you pay, the chances of you actually decrypting the entire storage is still, fairly low, because, sometimes these keys just don't work, right? So that data is still not fully within your control. And when it comes to the reason why you need your data properly protected is in terms of lapses, where they, got into Microsoft, they also got into Okta, where they actually stole the keys. Now you're now part of this whole big supply chain attack, right? So even though you have all these other controls, and essentially you have products from reputed companies, if they do get hacked like SolarWinds did, you now have a backdoor entry in your potentially secured environment. So you've done everything correctly. You have all the checks around your identity. You have multi-factor authentications turned on, all that stuff. Your servers are segregated, but you have that agent sitting on your file server, and now they have direct access into your file server. So then you need to label your data, or you need to do something with your data so that even if that's exfiltrated, it can be reused, right? So that's I think that's what we're going to be talking about going forward.
And I think on Lapsus, they did see that, I think it was it they had sensitive data on Slack. I remember reading some of the screenshots that were posted, and it was, knowing your data and making sure that data is stored in the correct location. So probably not on Slack.
Okay, so know your data classification. What does that mean?
So what that means is, in order to protect your data, you must first identify the types of information that's currently being stored and produced in your organization. So many organizations think of their content as being either internal or public. Anything that's internal is behind our firewall, and anything that's publicly available is going to be on our external website. But in the new digital workplace, the new digital age, it's become really pivotal to be able to collaborate and share information. Not only within your organization across teams and departments, but between organizations and with your customers and your suppliers to achieve those better business outcomes. So the efficiencies and increased productivity that you gain by breaking down those silos, now it means that where the content stored isn't necessarily as important as the type of information it contains, how sensitive that information is, and what impact it would have if it got into the wrong hands. How long that information should also be retained based on your industry regulations and your country's data privacy laws and protection laws are also very important. In this example, we have your public data. So that's, specifically been prepared and approved for public consumption, like a press release or job postings. And there's no sensitive information contained in it, and there's no risk if anyone else reads it. For your internal data, it's information that shouldn't be shared with the public. It could even be broken down further into subcategories as to information that could be shared externally with your partners, such as like project information that you're collaborating on, versus information that should stay internal to your organization, like your employee handbook. And then you have confidential data, which is sensitive information that could cause damage to your organization if shared with unauthorized people. So it should only be shared as needed, for people to complete their work. There's also subcategories to this as well, where we want to share confidential information with your external partners. Other information should be restricted to only within your organization. But either way, this type of information should really be protected with encryption. And then one level beyond that is restricted data. So this data is highly sensitive, such as personal identifiable information like your SIN numbers and birth dates, trade secrets that could be absolutely devastating if it was leaked. So this content should absolutely be encrypted to restrict who can access the information and even limit what actions they can take, such as making it read-only, blocking screen captures, blocking printing or copy and paste actions, and then even expiring access to the content after a certain number of days. So it's really the organization's confidential and restricted data that's most valuable to cybercriminals.
Yeah, absolutely. And you look at the type of data that attackers target. They're not necessarily going to target public information because, as it sounds, it's already public. They wouldn't directly go after internal information, but they could leverage it. So if you look at the context of this data, like if you were to get access to internal memos, then you learn how do they write emails, what is the footer, the letterhead, what does it look like? That makes them a lot more credible. But what they're after is between confidential and restricted information. It's the information that really has the most value to the organization, and it's the one that should have the most security controls around it, because that's what they're targeting. So if you're looking at a list of credit cards, a customer list, your health information, benefits, like there's a lot of information that organizations are obligated to hold. And we have to look and consciously think of what are the right controls. So when we're looking at the different labels, public, internal, confidential, restricted, the most sensitive information needs the highest sensitivity label. That's really the long and short of it. When we're looking at an engagement, and when we set up and we do like an objective style engagement or a red team style engagement, it's often these types of data that we're tasked with obtaining access to, because at the end of the day, if someone accesses internal information, it's not a press release, it's not a news article that's a data breach has occurred. Whereas when we see confidential and restricted information, it's in the news. It's something that is critical that's lost. And I always think of restricted being like that. What was it for KFC? KFC had the recipe, and they had it safeguarded in an actual locked safe. And then a reporter came by and said, great, I want to take a look at that. And the original, took a picture. That whole recipe then got leaked out online. So it shows you, it's about making sure that those controls are strong and then validating that they are effective.
Attacker targets and objectives.
Data protection is really the responsibility of everyone in an organization, and it can't just be an IT only, driven project and initiative. So as you can see in this slide, there's information that's been gathered and produced in each department that can be damaging if it falls into the wrong hands. So each department, should be involved in identifying the types of data they produce, share, store, as well as who needs access to that information in order to perform their jobs. So they should be able to identify, if any of their content contains sensitive information, and how long it needs to be legally retained, before it can be securely disposed of.
So all of the data that we see on the screen here is probably more towards the restricted type label. And if you look at them here from left to right, what is the reason that someone would go after potentially identifiable information or financial information or health information? Well, what they're after is, they're looking to pull off some type of an identity theft or fraud, right? Having enough information on a user to personally identify them, first name, last name, address, SIN number, that's really enough to sign up for a credit card. And when they're able to forge your identity, they're able to sign up for a credit card, they're able to really monetize the data that they have. Personally identifiable information, there's financial information, so credit cards, easy. They just sell them. And some of these credit cards are sold immediately as they're collected within minutes. Even from, if you think about like the credit card skimmers that you'd see at gas pumps, where they have the face, like a second face on top of the credit card reader, that information is often set up with a phone that will send the number out back to backhaul, and those credit card numbers are immediately then sold. So they're able to monetize it. And you think within Canada, the credit cards are actually worth more than they are in the States. I can't recall the exact numbers, but it's something in the magnitude of like $5 to $10 in the States and $20 to $40 for a Canadian credit card. But they're able to easily move those credit cards, and they have that when they obtain access to them. So that's why credit cards end up being quite the target. They're facing a lot of roadblocks, though. That's where, the things like tokenization and that sort of thing, and then health information. Health information ends up being a lot more valuable than credit cards because health information doesn't change. So if you know something about a health condition that an end user has, that's going to stay with them for life. When we're looking at the other buckets of data, so intellectual property, these are like your trade secrets. This is your proprietary materials design. This could be a recipe. This could be really anything. Could be specific drawings, but it's really that specific expertise that you own in your business. Someone could go after that, and this could be espionage, it could be extortion, it could be any others. But then you also have competitive information, so like market studies, business relationships, pricing, business plans. For competitors can compromise you and figure out how do you price your products or what the margins that you have, depending on the industry that you're in, that could be quite damaging. And as well as if that information is then, if someone is extorting you, you would have and hold a value for that information. And there may be other legal information, so specific to disputes or anything like that. And again, if leaked out onto the internet, on a pastebin or any other place, it could be quite damaging to the organization. And then finally, we have ransomware and supply chain. So any of the usernames, passwords, encryption keys, anything strategic about the security program, network diagrams, attackers go after that because it's kind of their situational awareness. You are here. Like you always think of that kind of direction on their logical network. It helps us understand where they are on the network. And if there's a particular area of the network that has key targets, like industrial control systems or something like that, it would help them know what is the right subnet they should be targeting and give them a bit more of a head start. But at the end of the day, a lot of this information can be used by various groups for various reasons. But these are just some examples.
I think what we're trying to showcase here is that it affects you from a personal standpoint all the way up to your corporate, I guess, compromise.
Absolutely.
And, it can damage your personal reputation and corporate reputation all within the same realm here. Let's talk about the data leakage scenarios. What are the different ways that data can leak out of an organization?
Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, when people think of data leakage, they usually associate it with like a cyber attack or someone acting with malicious intent. And while that does happen, people often forget that data can easily be accidentally leaked as well. So sometimes employees are trying to find ways to make their jobs easier or to make information easier for them to access after hours so they can meet their deadlines without thinking of, without actually thinking that they put that information at risk. So in the first example on the slide, how many people have gone to type someone's name in a new email message in Outlook and autocomplete fills in the name? So you type in Bob because you want to send it to Bob Smith, but since you've been working with Bob Baker more recently, it has the wrong Bob as the recipient. So you don't really notice. You attach, a confidential file, and then you write a nice message to Bob Smith and hit send. But now you send that information to the wrong person, and that data has been leaked. Another example, it's really common with using SharePoint and Teams for content management, is that, out of the box, when you first create one, it allows external sharing. And so, you can invite guests to collaborate with you. And if someone who isn't familiar with how permissions work, they could invite someone external to your organization into a team. So they could share maybe a single file with them. They're just trying to get their work done, but they haven't realized that they just shared everything in there, all the files, all the conversations, which might have sensitive and confidential information that you don't want getting out there. And then just to kind of pick another one, when it comes to Power Automate, it's a fantastic tool for automating processes, and it has hundreds of connectors you can integrate with other apps to increase productivity and streamline business processes. However, everyone in your organization has access to the default, personal productivity environment, so they can create their own flows. And if an administrator hasn't set up Power Platform data loss prevention policies, then anyone who creates a flow can actually connect to your business data and then send it elsewhere, like Dropbox or Google Drive. So, which again, it could be done by someone who doesn't necessarily have malicious intent, but it could also be an opportunity for a disgruntled employee to leak information. So you'd want to secure those areas to prevent that from happening.
So, what you're trying to say here, Desiree, is that even before you go into looking at specific data, I think you got to also look at data architecture and making sure that the technologies that you're using are correctly configured not to do unintended things, basically, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. You want to try and set them up securely and have that information architecture set up in a way to try and, anticipate these things that could happen and kind of mitigate any type of risk, and just kind of securely set things up to reduce how many people have access to accidentally change permissions or leak, as well as making sure that those people have appropriate training is really essential.
Because I've seen it so many times that there's a SharePoint site and then there's various folders, and in a traditional way, people have been granting different people access to different folders, and all of a sudden someone comes in and provides access to a top level site, a customer, and that customer gets access to every single folder under it. And then now you have cross contamination of data because they weren't supposed to have access to somebody else's data. So I think the architecture portion and the design portion is very important when you're talking about how you're setting up your data repositories. We talk about a lot about SharePoint, but I'm sure it's the same with Box and Dropbox and Google Drive and all these other data repositories as well. All right, stories from the red team.
So Desiree covered unintentional or non-malicious. These are all sort of malicious examples, not malicious in the true sense, but malicious in the sense of this is not something that your organization was designed to, wasn't designed for these type of scenarios, but these are the scenarios that we actually have pulled off on red team engagement. So often on a red team engagement, we'll start with a low privileged user, and we may start with no access, and we'll fish our way into the organization. But what happens is when we get the first credential and we get onto a service like SharePoint, we're going to be searching on that thing like crazy to try and find passwords. And we often find that it's possible even directly within their email to search for passwords. You just search for the word password, and usually that's enough. You may have 10 entries that come back. Depending on who you compromise someone in the help desk, it may be a long list. Hopefully passwords aren't being exchanged over email, but in the case that they do, the red team will find them. And it could be the red team or it could be the attacker. So we want to reinforce here that it's important where you store your data, because if it's able to be accessed in a means other than which you intended, so say your email does get compromised, but there's a lot of data there. And what we find that we're able to even search through email and find credentials or spreadsheets or certificates. We've found even private keys in emails, which is quite alarming. We've even had it where we compromise a low privilege user and we'll just ask for data over Teams. And it's whether or not that user, to Desiree's point, has been properly trained on security awareness, that they'll stop and say, why does this person need access to this? When we create the sense of urgency, I'm walking into a meeting with John Smith and we need access to this spreadsheet, payroll information. We would, once we get access to it, this will help us, in the meeting, that sort of thing. You come up with these stories, and it really helps us identify how likely this would be to happen. But we've actually done this. Over Teams, we've actually just asked for things, and we're in Canada. People are very friendly. They want to help, and that's really what it comes down to. We've got to really second guess and try to authenticate people who are asking for sensitive data and consider where they're asking for that data. If it's on Teams and they're asking for something quite sensitive, Teams may not be the right choice for that data, so find a different means. As well, on Microsoft SharePoint and file shares, we definitely search for passwords, and we have a long list of just different keywords that we'll search for on that end. What we often find is that passwords are stored in OneNote, they're stored in file shares or SharePoint, or just completely different places that they really shouldn't be stored. We've even found that it's possible to store passwords in those login scripts. So hidden in the background, when you boot up your computer, it connects into the network and it maps a bunch of drive letters. So if you were to have like a G drive or some other drive letter, we're going to search through the various Active Directory shares for those logon scripts and look through them and poke through them, look for credentials. And in a number of our red team engagements, we've actually found, this doesn't happen to all of them, but we've actually found domain admin credentials. So from a low privilege user, just looking at those different shares, we're able to find domain admin credentials, and those are quite quick compromises. And that's the entire organization that gets compromised through that data leakage. We've also seen inactive employee accounts being compromised by password spraying. So welcome to the company, welcome one is your password, and please change it. Oftentimes, a lot of users, when you ask them to change it and you set them off with a weak password from the beginning, when you say change your password, they just go welcome 2, welcome 3, welcome 4. We actually had an engagement that we delivered on that they started off with number 1. By the time that we compromised the credentials, they were up to, I think the number was like 53. So every 90 days for the last 10 years, they changed their passwords, and they did what they were told, but they just incremented by 1. So when we compromised the credential, it was flagged to the user, and they changed the password, and they incremented 1 more. So we're able to get back in and really tell the story and really elevate that, we got to choose stronger passwords. But that aside, these are definitely areas that we can find access to this data, and we're often asked to look for sensitive information when we're doing a red team engagement, because that's the massive impact to the organization is if restricted or confidential information is accessed, whether it be to enable unauthorized access or just be the data itself, it definitely has an impact on the organization.
All right, information protection lifecycle. I think what we have to understand is that each file and each set of data kind of goes through a life cycle. What is that life cycle? What does that mean? Like, is it from almost inception to tombstone, as we like to call it, an identity side of business? What does that mean for data?
Just like you said, it's from the moment you create that document until it's, securely disposed of. So we already kind of talked about, how you need to know your data so you can understand what information exists in your environment, because only then you'll be able to properly, be prepared to protect it over the course of its whole life cycle. So that's really the know your data piece, is classifying it, identifying what's currently there. And then the next step is, you want to protect that. So you determine the level of protection that's required for your content, depending on what classification you define. So you've got, remember, we had the public, internal, confidential, and restricted. So does it require just maybe a visual marking, like a confidential watermark, or internal only in the header or footer? Or does it require, additional protection, such as encryption or restricting, who the recipients are and what they can do? And then you want to prevent data loss. So data loss prevention is important for preventing people from oversharing sensitive information, such as, blocking an attempt to send credit card numbers over a Teams chat, or post them in a channel message, or sending bank account information, outside of your organization. Data loss prevention, can be applied to many different apps and services within Microsoft 365. So no matter where your data resides, such as like Exchange for email, SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, Power BI, even on-premise network drives. And then also endpoints like your devices, like laptops and cell phones. All of that can be protected to make sure that you don't have that sensitive information, overly shared unintentionally. And then finally, with governing your data, you want to make sure you don't hoard your data indefinitely. There's a lot of people out there, myself included, with my personal data. I keep it forever, which also actually puts you at risk, because just because you got a form from a customer 10 years ago, yeah, it's older information, but that doesn't mean that the individual's social insurance number or birth date changed, right? It's still relevant information. It's still sensitive information that needs to be protected and securely disposed of when it's no longer needed. So if it's not absolutely necessary to retain it, you need to make sure that you set up retention policies, not only for retaining it for a certain period of time, like if it's financial data, keep it around for 7 years. So even if somebody tries to delete it, you have a copy on hand. But it's also about making sure that you permanently and securely delete that content after a defined amount of time. And you can either include a disposition review ahead of time before it's permanently deleted, or it just gets removed. And then also, same with sensitivity labels. And data loss prevention policies. Retention can be applied to several different services, again, like Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, your Microsoft 365 groups, Teams messages, and Yammer. So you can really govern your content no matter where it's stored.
I think one of the points that I really wanted to make here was it's important to know where your data is stored. And the reason why it's important to know where your data is stored is the way the data is stored on Teams versus SharePoint versus OneDrive versus Yammer is vastly different, right? It also has its own policies that are unique to that technology. So, and a lot of people don't know this, the differentiation between OneDrive, SharePoint, and Teams. I mean, I see people sharing files to the entire organization using OneDrive all the time because, hey, you get 5 terabytes with it, right? With your Office 365 license versus SharePoint, you only get a terabyte. But the difference really is, other than the technical difference, which is OneDrive's on a slower disk, SharePoint's on a faster disk. That's why it's a little bit more expensive. But OneDrive is what's yours, right? Teams is what's ours temporarily, and SharePoint is what's ours on a more permanent basis. So, it's something that's meant to be shared with the entire organization and maybe beyond with proper policies, right? And it's very important. And I know, Desiree, you're going to dive into it a little bit in terms of data access control. But each of these have its own specific policies. Just because you apply a policy to OneDrive doesn't mean that it gets applied to SharePoint and it gets applied to Teams either. They have a rich set of policies that you need to tweak based on the scenario that you're going to use each of these technologies with.
With regards to different permissions and the different ways that it's applied. So like Teams is handled by group permissions, and SharePoint can get very granular all the way down to the document level. So yeah, to your point, it's you need to make sure that you secure each app or service in the way that it needs to be done, just to make sure that you secure your environment as much as you can.
Right. And I think there are different levels of policies that you need to apply. Like we talk about conditional access policies when it comes to Office 365 quite a bit, MFA, web only access. Really, I mean, for us, the way we like to govern and control data is really based on different conditions, right? So if we want to know where you're coming from, what device are you coming from, do we know who you are, right? Like I like to give this example to people. Let's say you decide tomorrow to go to Punta Cana and forget your password, so forget your computer at home. I don't want you to log into a hotel kiosk and just log in to an Office 365 environment. But if there's a fire which you need to put out, then again, there should be a granular policy that says, fine, I'll let you log in after a multi-factor challenge. I'll create an exception for that particular scenario, but I'm not going to allow you to download anything on your hotel kiosk computer, right? So, I'm going to still put a wrapper around it and say, you're going to work within the secure infrastructure that we've created for you, rather than just leaving your file behind after you log off. Not every computer on a kiosk basis is on a deep freeze where it deletes everything. It leaves things behind, right? So we want to talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, exactly. With those conditional access policies, enforcing multi-factor authentication is really important. So you have that additional level of security. It also provides you with the option of restricting access. So anyone that's on an unmanaged device, they have web-only access, so they can't download or print or sync their files, or you can even block their access entirely from anything that's unmanaged. And then another good practice, like you mentioned, is to sign out inactive users. So after a certain period of time, if on a browser session, if their activity is inactive, then you automatically sign them out, because we don't want them to walk away from a kiosk and then have the next person come in and they're already authenticated into your environment. So that's a really important thing. But yeah, when protecting data, there's several different access controls that can be implemented to secure your data and reduce the risk of data leakage. So, most of your content is typically stored in, Teams, SharePoint, and OneDrive. So understanding how the permissions are applied and managed is really important for managing who has access to that content and making sure that it's the right people. And so, for example, like you said with OneDrive, it's an individual, like it's my personal work files or working documents that I'm not ready to share, with a larger audience yet. And so, a really easy, quick win is to just block external sharing on OneDrive. So you just block that information from being shared with guest users. You don't have that leaked. It's only something that's internal. And then with Teams and SharePoint, then you want to limit who has full control over, those workspaces, so that not everyone can manage permissions and then accidentally invite someone, internal or external, who shouldn't have access. And so another good practice, is, like I mentioned, is when you create Teams or SharePoint out of the box, they're, they have external sharing enabled. So you disable that when it's not needed for any workspaces for your departments or internal only projects. Turn off the external sharing, and then also disabling anonymous links. So if you have an anonymous link in your environment, yeah, you can send that to somebody, but then they can send it to their friend, who then send it to their friend. And then when that link is used, you don't know who's actually using it. You don't have that information exposed to you in your audit logs. You can't really see who, they don't have to authenticate. It's really having that information that is now open to whoever's got that link. So those are some really good best practices just to lock that down. And then, like I spoke about earlier, implementing your Power Platform environment strategy for managing access, as well as your data loss prevention policies, is important to preventing that your business data from being shared with non-business apps. And then finally, it's a good practice to run permission reports for your Microsoft 365 groups, for SharePoint, for OneDrive, just to ensure the appropriate people have access to those resources, and review if external sharing links have been created in your environment and who they've been shared with. And then setting up like automated access reviews. So they can be set up so they're automatically sent out periodically, such as like quarterly, annually, semi-annually. So you can have your group owners review if guest users still require that access. So maybe the membership of who's worked on the project has changed, or that guest user moved on to another company. You want to make sure that you periodically review who's been granted access to your resources, and making sure that it's still valid, so you remove any of that stale access and ensure that again, only the right people have the right access to the groups and content that they need.
I mean, a couple of things to mention here is with the advent of Teams. I think one thing that I have seen quite a bit in many of the client environments is just team sprawl, right? Anybody and everybody just allowed to create teams and share it externally, and I think that's bad, and that's why there's policies that where teams should be controlled. Like you shouldn't just have people creating teams willy-nilly. There should be a proper structure to the teams, proper naming conventions, so what who is it shared with. Like within Crucial Logics, we either name it internal or external with the client name or the project name or whatever that is. But when you're talking about permission reviews, I think there's ways to automate it as well. Right. I mean, I think every Sunday I get an email of something that's about to be archived, and if I don't take an action in 7 days, it gets archived. Rather than me having to say yes or no, it just goes into a presumptive close. So I review it and say, okay, I don't need to really take action on it. If I say no, keep it, it will extend the the time that data is going to be live, and then after that, it just retires itself, right? You can make it really less administratively heavy, I would say, right? It can all be properly programmed, I would say.
Having that automation for group exploration and things like that, and just having those reviews is a really easy way to just stay on top of what's going on in your environment. And then having like a provisioning solution in place for creating new teams is pivotal, because then you can have that awareness of making sure that people provide classification for what is a group going to be used for, and justification as to why do you need a new one, and having that control, like you said, to manage that sprawl, and then making sure that it's configured appropriately depending on how it's going to be used, if it's internal only or if it's going to be collaborated on with external guests.
Yeah, and on that note, I mean, it's not like a set it and forget it type situation. Like there's an effort here of hardening the environment and locking it down and configuring the policies and the respective applications to make sure they're more secure. But then there's the operational activities of making sure on a periodic basis that things are still in line and they're still following the parameters that you've set out right, in order to make sure this is a successful endeavor. So it's really looking at it from all angles.
So sensitivity labels are used to protect your data wherever it resides. So they can apply watermarks, visual markings, and encryption. So it's protected, if it's in your cloud storage, if it's been downloaded, emailed, or saved somewhere else. You have that. The sensitivity labels actually stays within the content. So if somebody tries to download a file and then put it onto a thumb drive, if they send it to somebody else and they try to open it and they can't authenticate, then they'll actually be blocked from accessing it. So sensitivity labels are something that's really powerful that can help secure your data at rest, in transit, and in use when you're collaborating on it.
I think that protects against the USB falling in the back of the cab scenario, where if your data on that, was labeled correctly, once that USB goes into a foreign computer, it wouldn't really matter at that point.
So it's interesting is that it's security control, but it's also a target of attackers. So it's kind of in that weird, awkward spot. You look at a DLP, and Desiree will explain kind of the way that it's designed, but the DLP is really a filter. And all of the data that's going in and out of your network, whether it's being sent to the printer, whether it's being displayed on the screen, whether it's being exported to USB, wherever it's going, the data is going through that filter. And what happens is when the filter catches what it thinks is sensitive data, especially in April, people are doing their taxes. So the DLP engine, and I was a DLP administrator for a number of years, it will be looking for some numbers. And when it finds it, it flags it, and it creates an incident within the DLP solution. And the DLP will say, this user attempted to send this data out to the internet or wherever the destination is. But if we look at the DLP, it is then a source of a lot of incredibly sensitive information. And if someone obtains access to your DLP, they have access to all of the incidents that sort of matched or completely matched the rules that you have. So that's really going to be your repository of quite sensitive information. So obviously, make sure if you're using a solution like this, you're following your existing authentication identity management provider, and you have strong authentication. This isn't something that you would want to have just like a random welcome one type password on it, because if this is compromised, this potentially does have keys to the kingdom.
Yeah, so just to that point, you need to make sure that you restrict how many people have visibility into the compliance center where all this information is stored, because you don't want to have a notification being sent to say like a help desk user or something, and then all of a sudden they can see a list of credit card numbers and SIN numbers that may not be something that they should really have that visibility into. So for this example on the slide, let's say that somebody tries to share a document that has SIN numbers or credit card information in it. The DLP scans it. It checks to see if the external recipients in the list of people that they can actually, if they can actually see it, or if it has that sensitive information types that have been defined, you can have different thresholds saying, if it's 1 or 2, maybe it'll let it go. If it's a high volume, it'll just block that so that you can't even send that out externally. So like Richard said, it's got that filter. It's always checking for that sensitive information and then making sure that it's not being overly shared externally, or even within the organization to different groups if you don't want it to be.
Data retention.
Yeah, I sort of touched on this a little bit with regards to making sure that data retention is not only for making sure that you have a copy of it for a certain duration of time, just that you're legally required to keep it, such as like financial data, but there's also data protection laws like the GDPR in Europe that make sure that you don't actually keep personal identifiable information. You don't keep it for longer than you actually needed to, or you have the ability to destroy it, and making sure that you don't ask for more sensitive information than you actually need in order to complete your process. So retention will, keep a copy of however long you need, but then also securely will destroy that information. So you can do a disposition review before it's destroyed, or it can just permanently delete it, and then it's out of your environment. And you don't have to worry about that. So things like this, you can apply it to, Teams chat messages, to SharePoint, Teams, OneDrive, a variety of different places, just to make sure that you meet all those regulatory requirements.
Absolutely. Auto labeling. I think this is something that can help the administrators take the administrative burden of labeling away. But I think one key element to this whole governance of data is that data governance is not an IT project, right? It's you need to speak with different business lines and data owners in terms of how they want their data to be labeled. You can't just, it's not one size fit all. So it's a business project more than an IT project. So unless you have a buy-in from business and various different departments, this whole governance piece is going to fall flat on its head. So how does auto labeling help sort of ease that stress of labeling different types of data?
Yeah, auto labeling definitely helps when it's you're managing a large number of documents. You want to manage it at scale. You can apply auto labels if it automatically detects sensitive information within a document. So if it it's constantly scanning and it says, okay, there's credit card information in here, we're gonna either notify the user that they need to apply a certain level of labeling, such as confidential or something, or it could just automatically apply it. So if you can have trainable classifiers, so if you want, you can actually train artificial intelligence, machine learning, that this is what a contract document looks like, and here's the types of information that's in it, and this is how it should be classified. Or you have additional add-on like SharePoint syntax, where again you can train it and say here's the different types of documents. It can not only extract information out of it like different dates or metadata, but you can also get it to apply sensitivity labels and retention labels at the same time. So that makes it really easy for it to automatically classify what type of content this is, and then how do we apply the labels for protection and retention for its lifecycle management. And then there's other things you can do, like with cloud app security, where you can, even if there's no sensitive information in the document, and even if it's something different than you've trained your AI, you can actually apply a sensitivity label directly to like a SharePoint library. So everything I put in the SharePoint library is going to have the same sensitivity label. Doesn't matter if it has sensitive content or not. I know that it's secured. It has maybe encryption on it, and it's only available for these select recipients internally or something like that. So there's a variety of things you can do so that it's not such an administrative headache, or having to put that onto your users to constantly be applying the labels. If you can do a lot of it at scale, then that'll save you a lot of time, and also prevent the situation where you have users incorrectly applying labels that they really should have something of a higher sensitivity, but they left it with something a little bit more open. And then you also have the flexibility of applying default labels too, just to have like a minimum level of security, or at least like a minimum watermark or something like that. So there's a lot of things you can do that can save you a lot of time.
So verifying your data is protected.
So we talked about a lot of controls, and they're amazing controls when implemented correctly. But what happens when they're not implemented correctly? And how do we know that they have been implemented correctly? We have to verify it. And the way that we verify this is through different types of engagements. So we specialize in ethical hacking, and there's a couple of different engagements that we could leverage to really validate whether or not that information is protected. And it's the same for any teams that you're working with. It's really understanding and trying to really, as an adversary, attempting to get access to that information. So we have labels on our data, we have the retention set up, and we have rules, we have alerts, and we're monitoring them. But when an attacker goes after that data, how do we know that that unauthorized access has been obtained? How do we know that the labels that have been applied are effective? How do we know DLP is catching that that attempt of exfilling a list of 65,000 credit cards? Well, we don't know that until we attempt it. So it's worth first, from an architectural perspective, making sure we have the right controls. From a design perspective, making sure they're configured correctly, but then verifying once they've all been implemented, verifying that they actually move the needle on security. They're actually making us more secure as a result of the changes that have been implemented. So we often hear in discussions a lot of pushback on certain things of saying attackers can't get to that share, or they would never find that. Well, we don't know these. These are false assumptions that we could definitely make, and they definitely help us sleep better at night. But in reality, they may be exposed on Teams. They may be exposed on OneDrive, may be exposed in different places. So it's about testing to try and see, can we get access to this? And it's about searching through SharePoint, searching through any of these different areas to understand whether or not that data that's labeled correctly can then be accessed through any unauthorized means. So it's really about the end user awareness aspect of it, and really verifying that if we're saying they should be encrypted, they should be stored in this place, there's no exceptions.
All right, so this is some food for thought, right? What is your high value, high risk data, and do you know where it's saved? How often do you review the group memberships and permissions, both internally and for guest users? What compliance requirements does your organization need to adhere to? And what will be the biggest challenge in rolling out proper information protection strategy? I think this is something that our audience should really think about, before really looking at their data and looking at a overall data governance strategy. And these are some basic questions that they need to kind of, ask themselves to take the next steps.